Hi, I'm Charlotta and this is the School of Pattern Cutting. Welcome to my channel. If you haven't watched my tutorials before, please subscribe so you don't miss them. I love all things pattern cutting and vintage fashion, and today I'm going to share 5 fantastic tips on fitting I've learned from vintage pattern cutting books. Enjoy! You can see I've got quite a choice of vintage books here. It's quite hard to pick your favorite, but I've tried my hardest to pick just one fitting tip from each book, and that's especially looking at sort of different amounts of fit, so the basic bodice block compared to your foundation garments or your moulage and all these sort of things, but also sort of quite interesting techniques which I hadn't come across before, because techniques change all the time, fashion changes all the time, of course, so that also really influences how fitting is taught, because very few of us now wear full-on corsets like they did a while ago. So it's basically, you know, even in these books, the amount of information they give you, what sort of information they think is necessary, changes all the time. And some of these books actually offer conflicting information as well, so I thought it'd be really interesting to share, and you can pick the ones you like. I'm quickly gonna just hold them up to the camera so you can have a look at them. First up, we've got a tiny book full of information called Your Pattern Cutting by E. Sheila McIan, and that's from it was started in the 40s but then published in the 60s, and I'll put all the titles in the description for you. Then I've got a 1960s 1970s book called Introducing Pattern Cutting by Anne Tuit. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I came across that randomly when looking for something else, but the title and the image cover is just beautiful, very graphic, so I had to buy it, and it's actually quite interesting. Then I'm also going to look at a really interesting in-depth book, and if you're passionate about how sizing works, how grading works, ease, all these sort of commercial aspects, and especially maybe if you're making clothes for other people, this is a really fascinating book. So it's called Sizing, Pattern and Construction for Women's and Children's Garment by Philip Koenig. It's a real reference book. It's from the 50s again. It basically gives you everything about the skeleton, different measurements, different national sizes, lots of drafting and grading as well. And I think it's goes anywhere from children's wear to plus size. So it's really interesting about fitting for different body shapes. And finally, I'm also picked up some tips from one of my favorite pattern cutting designers, which is Natalie Prey. She's British. She ran a fashion and pattern cutting school, and I picked a tip both from her dress pattern designing, which I think is her first one, and then there's also more dress pattern designing by her, which is her second book, but she's written a few more as well, I think. So I'm gonna just share a page of each with a really interesting tip or aspect on fitting and pattern cutting. I've chosen my tips in order of the fitting process, so you can they're relevant to how you actually start out. And the first tip comes from this beautiful little book. As I said, that's from roughly the 1940s, but it was sold later on, but the designs are all from the 40s, and therefore the fit is from the 40s, because the fit changes with fashion, as Natalie Prey says. The reason I wanted to show you this little diagram, because it's really interesting, because if you've done my basic bodice, the made to measure course on my website, you might have noticed that halfway through I actually say, now you've drafted your square shape, you can make your first trial and actually check the fit, or you can continue with the waist shaping. And in here they do exactly the same. They do the square bodice block first, so all the fitting above the bust line first, and then they actually go through all the fitting issues because they make it easier to fit the area if you're not distracted by overfitting below. And once you're happy with your square garment, your blocky garment, then you can actually move on to doing the waist fitting. And this is all the sort of advice they give on the waist fitting. There's a few points there, but I find it really fascinating how clear it is, but also how, if you ever bought a commercial pattern, or even if I look at my block patterns for the mannequin, so my sample sizes, everything is very symmetrical. It's like not like nearly what people might call a cookie cutter template. So all the darts are the same height, they're the same, they're even, you know, all this sort of stuff. On here you can actually see that, first of all, on the front waist dart is completely uneven. So the center front side is smaller than the side side. And also the top is curved, and it's quite long at the bottom and quite short at the top. So it's really fitted to the specific persons. They've drawn it in a way where you can see, oh, they don't have to be symmetrical. And similar with the back, it's actually different to the front. And they're also giving you option to actually splitting your waist darts for even better fit for very fitted garment, which I love. You might also notice that on the side seam you got 3 options. So she included a fitted seam option, a semi-fitted side seam, and also just your square straight side seam. So that's quite interesting to sort of note that we quite often think there's only one option, but as soon as you start drafting different styles, you will have lots of different options. And finally, you might have noticed, which is quite a lovely 1940s details I've seen quite a lot, is that they angled the center back line for more fit. And I rarely see that in sort of commercial contemporary styles. We try to keep our center back straight, but as soon as you go into vintage, they put in fitting in the center back, and it makes complete sense because as most of us, our back goes in a bit. So that's a lovely little vintage drafting method you might consider too. So this was my little tip from the Sheila McIan book. Let's have a look at some Natalie Bray. Natalie Bray actually inspired Sheila McIan, and the little note at the front says, where does it say? I found it the other day. It says, oh yeah, here you go. Look, dedicated to Natalie Bray. So we're actually going the wrong way around. So she inspired her, but we started the other way around. Again, Natalie Bray is, I think she started teaching in the 40s. These books are more from the 70s, but this is the 3rd edition, for example. It has a metric element already, so it went on for a long time. So it's published in the 60s, but again, a lot of the fitting styles are older as well, a lot of construction methods. But she's very clear that basically construction changes as fashion changes. From her book, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about side seams again. So we looked a little bit of side seams in the last book, but of course Natalie Bray, but I wouldn't recommend it as a beginner's book because she goes into a lot of details and she uses a lot of terminology. So you have to really have your drafting hat on, or read it when you're a beginner. You might not understand absolutely everything, and then read it again and again, and every time I read it I learn something new. And everything is in imperial. It's got a metric supplement, but if you're a pure metric person, all your education has been in metric, it can be a bit confusing, I find. But let's talk a bit about the side seam. What is really interesting that throughout she gives sort of notes on how our drafting actually reflects our body shape. So she says the side seam is fixed by 2 points, the underarm point at the top and the hip point or the waist point. And she actually talks about the correct position is that it's either right in the middle underneath your arm, like in the middle of your bodice at the side, or slightly back, which looks nicer to the front if you don't see a seam. And she also really talks about how the shape of a side seam is really important. So the shape of a side seam, as it appears on the pattern, follows as closely as possible the natural shape of the average figure. So you can see on the back, it curves from the straight line, because the figure here is usually flat and often hollow. On the front, you can see the opposite. It actually curves out where the bust is, so that's our true bust line, and then it pulls in again. So because if you didn't have that curve on a very fitted style, the seam would be pulled forward by the curviness at the front. And then she gives some more description how basically underneath the waist, they both curve out because our hip curves out both at the front and the back. So it's sort of just like we sort of the reasons why you go this curve this way and that way. As soon as you read it, it makes complete sense, and you've probably been doing all that, but it's always interesting when they go into the details of it. And what I found quite interesting on on this page, she actually talks about how, so this is the 50s, 60s, how a lot of commercial patterns also on very fitted styles curve the back side seam, because that way you add extra bust width, and that way you can really fitted style, but you have enough bust width. So you basically, if it's too tight around the bust area, rather than making the front wider, a lot of patterns just curve the back pattern. But she said the problem, which is really interesting, is that of course that does not follow a natural shape. So it introduces extra bust width lacking in the pattern. This shape of side seam is much used, but even its adoption by fashion designers and by the wholesale manufacturing trade does not alter the fact that it does not follow the natural shape of the figure. And that's what you always have to think, that sometimes if patterns don't fit you, it's because it's made for the manufacturing industry. Might be quite easier to do that rather than change the whole shape of a pattern. And it's also done for a specific figure, which might not be you. So always think about your natural shape, rather than that's your starting point, rather than trying to fit into a manufactured pattern. So that was my little tip from Natalie Bray. Let's look at another book. The next book is Philip Connick's Sizing, Pattern, Construction and Grading. I'm only going to look at it very quickly. If you're interested, let me know in the comments below and I will do a proper analysis of this book because it's so in depth. I'm just going to show you a few things. It's full of super helpful and informative diagrams, basic ease about different sizes. Look, they got lots of pages on how to actually measure and the science of measuring and stuff like that. Lots of amazing rulers. So I'm going to just quickly talk about one specific thing which I found really interesting. But yes, let me know if you want a proper review of this book. The reason I wanted to look at this, because we've been talking quite a lot about ease. So if you remember, we've been talking about fitting ease on Patreon, and here they actually show about where and how much ease. So this is again 50s, 60s, but this is where they add ease. So you can see how they add ease absolutely everywhere. So the strong line is, the black line is your moulage or your very fitted or your foundation pattern, so that fits like a second skin. And then you can see the dotted line is actually how he adds ease. So all of us might recognize how you always move your bust point back, for example, and make that a bit wider. So we're actually adding ease there, we're adding ease at the side, we're actually changing the armhole quite a lot, and he adds quite a lot of ease on the shoulder as well, and also changes the position of the dart at the back a bit. So I just want to quickly show you that because that's really interesting how different ways of drafting ease. So for example, my basic bodice block already incorporates that ease when you're drafting. Naturally Bray does the same. She drafts a bodice block with 4 inches of ease, but on here he actually starts as a really 0 ease foundation block and then adds lots of extra ease. So that's different way of doing it. So again, something which you might not come across, but which is really interesting. So this was my little tip from Philip Koenig. I'm now going to move on to Anne Tut, who disagrees with Philip Koenig on something else. So I wanted to share it with you. The disagreement they have is about the placement of the shoulder seam. So Philip Koenig, who writes for the manufacturing industry, talks about that historically our shoulder seam has been set back and the side seam as well, so that if you're looking at somebody from the front, you don't see the shoulder seam or the side seam. So you basically chop off a bit from your front pattern and move a bit of your shoulder and a little bit of your front side seam to the back. No, from the back to the front, sorry. So you basically, the seams go to the back. And Philip Koenig says that's a great idea, but in manufacturing, it basically makes things more complicated. So to make things easier commercially, we're going to move everything to the top of the shoulder and to the side seam. Because of course, if you're doing piecework in a factory, having maybe the side seams at different positions, or shoulder seam, and if you have a 2-piece armhole, all that sort of stuff, it basically commercially isn't always what suits us best or looks the best. So Anne Tut, by comparison, she uses the pattern where you have your shoulder seam and your side seam move back to the back pattern. But then of course the great thing is, and she just here demonstrates, that you can easily always have a line, and then you can chop it off again and put it to the front. So you could even have on your basic bodice block, have your shoulder seam right on the top of your bodice and your side seam down the side. And this is, which is actually how my basic bodice block is, because that way you know exactly where it goes. But then it might be nice for a more aesthetically pleasing look is to have another block where you have your shoulder seam and your side seam moved slightly back, so it looks nicer when you're meeting somebody. But that's just a little tip from Anne Tut and a disagreement with Philip Koenig. Well, not disagreement, but history changes, and so does drafting. That brings us to our last tip, and guess who it's by again? So yes, we've got another Natalie Bray, of course, and this is this second book, more dress pattern designer, and there it's purely about designing. The first one is also about drafting your blocks. So you can see on here she's basically talking all about the princess dress and the panel bodice, and that's how it starts off. So that's about creating, rather than having a separate bodice block and a skirt block, you're basically creating a longer fitted block. But the reason I wanted to show it with you is because that's really interesting, is how you can see again the thinner black lines are your basic bodice block, and then the thick black lines are your princess bodice block. So you can see how the gray areas, that's your shaping on your basic block, but then on the princess line everything actually gets slightly curved. So again, the dart position of the shoulder actually changes position a bit, and it curves with your body. So Natalie Bray is really important. It talks quite a lot about how it's really important that the pattern follows your natural figure, and that's again, that's a really good example of it. So rather than having a straight line running down your body, for most of us a slightly curved line is actually more authentic and suits us better. So one way you could actually ascertain that line is just by putting a bit of tape on your fitted block, like we talked on Patreon before. And again, on the back, she actually adds, can you see, a lot of shaping, but that's of course because you lose some shaping in the side seam when you create a princess block, because you can't go in and out as much because it's not as flattering. And then again, you also got, you can add extra shaping. You can, oh, this is, look, this is the center back line. Can you see how it actually curves out and in again? So you get a really closely fitting one. So again, on the basic bodice block, you just have your shoulder seam for fitting, but for a lot of us, actually, a little bit of extra fitting around the neckline, the center back, will get us a lot better fit. So this is my favorite little tip on getting the best out of your fit, as advised by lots of vintage pattern cutting. I do hope you enjoyed my little foray into the depths of vintage pattern cutting and all the amazing things we can learn from all these masters of a skill and use it to improve the fit of our own garments. If you're after a bit more pattern cutting and want to learn how to make your own clothes, do have a look at my Patreon membership. There's a link in the description as well. There's lots of tutorials. I share things like these, but also guides on fitting, proper vintage pattern cutting tutorials, and live Q&As. Also, if you don't want to miss any future content, please do subscribe and hit the little bell so you don't miss any more videos from me. But that's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed all these vintage pattern cutting books. I certainly enjoyed sharing them with you, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!